Very nice to see you. I've designed today to be very focused and very practical, and I hope we can engage in some conversation. I told a colleague yesterday I have a total of 6 slides. One of them is a title, and one of them is a joke. Okay? So you got to sit through 4 slides and some conversation, because it's a busy week. I want you to know what you're in store for. So first of all, yeah, this topic has come up because of the QEP primarily. And a lot of you may have reflective writing assignments that you use apart from the QEP, and this can also apply there. But as a university, we're about to begin a much more intentional focus on reflective writing. Those electronic portfolios that you heard a lot about last year, reflective pieces are going to end up in those. And for those to yield valid assessment, we have to know what we're doing in terms of assigning, integrating those with our course curricula, and then evaluating those. So those are the kinds of needs that I'm going to try to address today. So first of all, basically, the purposes of reflective writing, well, they're to reflect on a student's personal experience, or perhaps on a reading. You can have reflective writing assignments that are just based on a course reading. But for QEP purposes, it's more likely to be an experience, a cross-cultural study, a practicum, something that they've done outside of the classroom. And then the second part, reflective writing expects that students will draw some conclusions about that experience. Okay.
That's a joke.
That's the joke. Okay. So we're now halfway through. So the basic definition is really simple, right? Reflective writing that draws conclusions. This is the first place I'd like to hear from you a little bit. Why are we here? And if you need me to unpack my intent with that question, what are the complexities of assigning reflective writing? Because doesn't it seem like it should be so easy? Students do something, you say, write me a couple paragraphs reflecting on that experience. They share profound insights, and everyone goes away enriched. Why does that not happen? Kevin Brown.
Also known as the colleague. They don't write anything reflective, they simply summarize.
Okay.
This
Yeah.
is the biggest problem I see.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the biggest problem across the board, is that by reflection, students sometimes understand you to mean description. So they'll talk about what they did on their 5 days in some country or on their observation week, but they won't do anything other than describe. Yes?
I think part of our students' problems, the unique problem to us, is that they write a reflection after every 10 hours of service, and those aren't graded the way we grade reflective writing, and so they think it's one thing, and we think it's something else.
Yeah, those service hour reflections have done more to damage reflective writing as a concept than anything else. And then they serve their purpose, okay, so I don't intend exactly to criticize those, but students write those for a different purpose than we want them to write these reflective writings. So these reflective writings really are to demonstrate learning, where the service learning reflections, I think, are more just to demonstrate, did you do something? Do you understand why it was service? Okay, that is a kind of learning. But this is reflective writing that's connected to the concepts in a course. But students are used to writing those reflections after every 10 hours. They're short, the prompt they get is pretty prescriptive. And I guess I'll say this, at least English majors have a sense that nobody really reads those. And so it doesn't really matter what they say, because they never get any response for it, they never get any evaluation, they get credit for service. And so to them it feels like words put out into the void. And so they don't put much care into it. Now, maybe English majors are special in valuing their writing so much more. I don't think so. Okay? So part of what we have to do is intentionally separate course-based reflective writing from the reflective writing that they're doing in those 10-hour service increments, because it's called reflective writing, but for a whole different purpose. Anybody else, are there other things that make this difficult? Why did you want to come talk about it today? Because 11 o'clock is not too early and not too late. That's why I asked for this time. Yes, Vanessa.
I have struggled this past year trying to get my nursing students to do exactly what you're talking about. Don't give me a description of what you've done. I want to know how you feel about what you've done. And I don't know that they've ever done much of that. And so I find a lot of them don't know how to go deep within themselves, I guess.
Mhm.
And, I did have my 100 class last fall. It was a requirement that they kept a journal, and they journaled weekly. And I had 60-something of those students. I read them weekly, and I commented on each and every one of them because I wanted them to know that I had read what they said. And so it gave it some validity, and those were more personal, that journal, but when I asked them to write a paper that was reflective, that's where I couldn't, even if I gave them an example, this is a reflective paper. It was like pulling teeth out of a chicken, and I don't know, chicken don't have teeth, folks. So, or lips, all right, so chicken don't have teeth, so I felt like I was.
Things I'm learning at university.
Yeah. I was struggling. So, how can we get to the point to where, and these were freshman students, or mostly freshmen, so how can we teach them what reflection is?
I think part of the issue is trust. A lot of people have a lot of difficulty of letting you see what's inside me until I know that you can be trusted with knowing what's inside of me, because you're not gonna turn that against me.
Yeah, reflective writing inhabits this really difficult space between the personal and the professional, the emotional and the academic, and there can be some real difficulty in there for students in knowing what and how much to share, and sometimes for us in knowing how to respond. Occasionally, students share things that you wish you had not read for one reason or another, and then you have to engage with that, but you have to engage with it as a person, not as a professor. But then at some point, you also have to put a grade on that thing. And so it can be very problematic depending on what students share and how much of this kind of personal risk is involved for both student and professor. No, I do not wish to update Toby at this point. I tried to list a few things that I thought were some of the challenges, and a lot of your comments have touched on them already. So that the challenges in reflective writing, well, for our purposes, it has to assess student learning. So in your courses, it's gonna have to be tied to course objectives or specific readings or specific theories or constructs that you're studying in that class, not just a story of what I did last week. The prompt has to balance giving too much direction with giving too little. Because if you give too little direction, that's when you get those summary papers. Okay? If you give too much, you risk creating the sense that there's really only one thing you want to hear. And students have told me this does happen on the service learning reflections even, and some of them may have talked to you about it, that even if they didn't like their service learning, or they thought it was silly, or they didn't get anything valuable from it, they feel like they can't say that because there's only one approved response, which is this service made me and the God's kingdom better. And so they write that, but it's not authentic. But because of the way that a prompt is presented, sometimes they may feel they have to follow a certain line in terms of what they're allowed to say or not allowed to say. So writing a prompt for a reflective assignment is really tricky. It's got to hit the balance between these two poles. Then assessment has got to account for the fact that these are personal experiences, so they're going to be very different. One student's reflection might look quite different from another. Some might be very personally revealing, others might not be. If it's a graded assignment, you still have to have some mechanism whereby you grade them all fairly, and you grade them all based on how well the student learned the material, not how much the student tugged on your heart. Although the two things are almost impossible to distinguish sometimes. And then finally, I listed instructors need to consider our responsibilities. These are emotional responsibilities. Sometimes these are responsibilities of fairness to others in the class. Sometimes they may be ethical responsibilities. A lot of the research that I did to prepare for this presentation, a lot of the research about reflective writing actually comes from the healthcare professions, where in schools of nursing, therapy, and medical schools, they're doing a lot of reflective writing as part of what they call reflective practice. And there are a lot of really strong quantitative studies about the impact of reflective writing. And I was surprised, I didn't really realize that that was happening, and that they've got much better research on this particular topic than writing studies has. The writing people come at it from a different perspective. So in those cases, an ethical response has to do with, what if a student's reflection reveals that they've done something which violates patient care standards? Okay? What do? You just say, good story? I'm looking particularly at the front corner here. No, you don't, but you have to have some plan for that. Even over the summer, I don't remember if any of you were in that group who scored the Global Perspectives essays. A few of them, the students went on a trip, they came back from somewhere, they wrote their reflection, and they were still so racist. Some of them, I was overwhelmed by some of what I read, and I'll use one example because I will never forget it. A student went on a trip to a Native American reservation and was describing a tribal ceremony, and she wrote, it was obese men dancing half naked, ew, and the ew was in the paper. That's not me adding it, that was spelled out. And this was her honest reflection, but if I were the trip leader, I would really want to respond in terms of ethics, personal dignity. You don't necessarily have to like this form of dance, but I would like you to show that you understand something of its cultural significance. And so when the student just comes back and writes, ew, that then puts on me a really difficult burden in terms of response if I'm that instructor. So reflective writing is complex for students and complex for us, and I don't want to underplay either side of that. That it's actually probably much easier to grade a straightforward research paper because you don't get into all these tensions between the personal and the safely academic. Okay. Does anybody have questions before we move on? All right, I told you we're halfway. Classic teaching offers sort of a problem-solution model. Solution coming up. First, just a summary point. I would expand the original definition of reflective writing to say that the best reflective writing is personal, yet still thoughtful, critical, and grounded in course concepts. And from your comments, I think that's a definition you all share, but I wanted to get it in writing here. Because as you're writing prompts and as you're writing rubrics or other assessment instruments, these ideas have got to be in those prompts. They've got to be in those assessments. What I want to show you next is a model that is from a book that was published in 1988. The citation's on the next slide. But it's a model for reflective writing that's very commonly used, and again, very commonly used in some of the healthcare profession reflective writing studies. And I chose to focus on this one because, to me, it seems like it's adaptable to almost any discipline. So what it's going to do is give you and students a very clear framework for structuring what should a reflective essay look like and what should be in it. So basically, if you read down the left column, the reflective essay has three main parts. First, there's the what, then there's the so what, then there's the now what. Okay? And I think even if you have to present it to students that way, it's simple, but it's a framework that then they can follow. So you got three sections, what, so what, and now what. And then each of those sections has two subcategories. Yes, Karen?
I know in the medical research, they often, when they're looking at reflection papers, they have 2 pages. On the left page is pure description, on the right page is analysis.
Mhm.
And then you do it within 24 hours. So in your cross-cultural, that would be interesting. You just write about it, you are with the camera, and then you don't critique it until a different time. I think that's kind of nice to separate the two, so you're not giving your opinion.
Yeah, and it might be interesting to see that, even to change the format of an academic document and to see those side by side. So there's a column that's description, like field observations, and then there's a column right next to it that's analysis or interpretation. So yeah, there are a lot of possibilities that you could build into an assignment to help students get to this kind of reflective thinking.
they're writing that. I had an experience my first semester. I did assure the students that my eyes would be the only eyes that saw what they wrote, and I would not share it with anyone else. There was one student in particular, and speaking to the ethical part of it, there was one student in particular, as I started reading her writing in her journal, I developed a concern for her. And then observing her in my classroom, and I did get concerned for her, and so I had to do something. And so I did reach out to someone else and say, I believe there is something here. At no point did I share anything as to what she had written, or nothing. I just said, I believe there is a concern here, can you check on this student? And, that student was removed for medical reasons. So, you know, had I not had that type of an assignment, I'm not saying that someone wouldn't have noticed it or whatever, but yes, it did become my responsibility, I felt like, to take an action because I recognized, I had given that assignment and recognized what was coming out of it. And I think when we do these assignments, like you were saying, we have to have a plan. So if something is revealed, they divulge something to us, that it can't just be overlooked, passed off, a check on the paper and whatever, that we do realize that we have to respond to that.
Yeah, absolutely, and there are cases where students want to reveal that and they want a response. And that's a shifting of the teacher-student role into more of a therapist kind of role. And that's a shift that's uncomfortable for a lot of us. It's uncomfortable for me because I'm not a therapist. But we get put into that role sometimes because of students' needs, or I think it happens a lot, especially with writing, that, you know, they're putting things on paper just to us that they may not have said out loud to other people. So if you haven't done a lot of this writing, I don't want you to think it happens every single time. Not every single reflective paper is full of ethical dilemmas, but when they come up, they're important. They, you know, they need to be addressed. Can we go ahead and talk about some of these now? So first, if you're setting up a prompt, your prompt has to be structured so that students can clearly see how these three segments are part of their paper. So you clearly want some description, you can specify how much or what you want described. You know, this is where, as we talk, each of you, just think about your discipline and the assignments you give, and what would this look like for you. And I hope we'll have a few minutes that you can talk about that a little bit at the end of the session. So they describe something, what happened, or what they read, if this is a reflection of a reading. And then they describe their internal experience. So what were you thinking or feeling as this was happening? But then you move to the deeper level, the so what, which contains an evaluation section, most simply expressed as, well, what was good or bad about the experience? My favorite is the fourth box down here, the analysis section. And when it asks, how can you interpret the experience in light of course material? That's where you're gonna ask students to really draw in references to things you've read in class, apply theories you may have taught them in class, connect their experience to course discussion, where you're asking, even though this is not a research paper, you're asking them to make explicit connections to sources other than their own experience. Because then they're showing the lenses through which they're reflecting. You get that? Okay. Now this doesn't have to be long. This whole thing could be 3 paragraphs, you know, 1 paragraph for each of these sections. But I think it's this movement out of their own heads into a text, and then back again into their own experience. This diagram is often portrayed as a circle, but I couldn't make that fit well on my slide, okay? But if it helps you to imagine it as a circle, it's going from your experience to texts and theories and models from your discipline, then back to your experience projected toward the future. And so when you set up your prompt, make sure you set up a prompt that gives students ample opportunity to do this analysis section, and that they know they have to do it, because that's the part that they often assume is not relevant to reflective writing. And then the so what, I think this is the part that might look different according to discipline, but when they come to the end of this, you ask them, maybe, what else could you have done, or what could you have done differently? Or if it's a situation where they'll be in it again, what do you wanna do differently next time, kind of looking ahead and planning, okay, you've done this thing, you're gonna have to do this thing 5 more semesters. What do you think is would help you do better? So they're assessing, we're learning, assessing successes and failures, and making a specific plan for what they're gonna do next. And putting that plan in writing is also an important part of helping them actualize it. That once you've figured out something and put it down on paper, it's easier to make it happen, which any of us who have made New Year's resolutions know at least a little bit, okay? And in other cases, the simple what else could you have done or what would you have done differently would be enough. But I like that part about the action plan for implementation. And then the citation is down here. This is from Gibbs. And you'll see this cited all over the web. If you want to find a diagram to show your class, there are dozens of them that are quite similar to mine. It's the basic model that's used for teaching this type of writing in a lot of contexts. This is not the only model, but for a 50-minute session on one day, I thought this is a good one, and I think should be adaptable for a lot of you. Okay, let me pause there, and because a lot of you have nodded at me encouragingly, which I appreciate, and would you sign up for English 110?
They didn't quite give you that feedback.
No, this is their feedback. You take what you can get. Yes, Jared.
In a course I teach, we reflect on cases, but we're not actually doing anything. So I need some ideas. We're not talking about service learning, so what are we talking about? Describe what happened.
In that, so it's cases that they're reading about or
Yeah.
things they have observed?
Reading.
Yeah, so then in describe what happened, maybe
Yeah.
break down what are the key features of this case?
Okay.
What are the key conflicts or what, with this,
Right.
some kind of summarized description. What is the case? If the thinking and feeling part is relevant, they could bundle that in. Did this, I don't even know what kind of cases you'd have, but did this create any emotional, emotional response or questions for you as you were reading it?
Yeah, the analysis, that's pretty much what I've done
Yeah,
so far, but.
Exactly, that's what I think you would do, is then go
Okay.
back and ask them,
Okay.
okay, using our course materials, and you can even refer them to a specific article,
Right.
if there's some specific concept you're trying to get them to think about, using the article about this theory,
Okay.
explain how it would apply to this case. And then maybe if you wanna do the action plan part, twist it up a little bit and say, like, what advice would you give to this practitioner as he or she continues to work with this case? Something like that, they could still make that application to the future, even though they're not really gonna do anything else.
Otherwise, would it be, or are we talking about embedded and enhanced projects for individual classes?
Could be.
Okay.
Yeah, so yeah, if you have a service embedded class, then I think some kind of piece of writing like this would be really, really useful. I think it's true, Karen, in most of the departments, there are a few classes that are where reflective writing is gonna be asked for the QEP, for the electronic portfolio. So whether it's a service embedded class or not, you may be teaching a course where you're gonna be asked to collect some writing samples from your students to satisfy the QEP goals. So think beyond just your service enhanced classes. And then in a lot of classes, whether there's a QEP or not, this kind of writing is really helpful for students. So I don't think we have to be in a QEP year to talk about it, but it does give us a little extra urgency. And Beth, I want you to give you a minute to talk about or to share some examples. How does this work in your discipline, or how could you make it work?
I do want to say I'm okay with the what and so what. I'm not processing very well the now what, given that sometimes these are snapshot experiences, and there is not going to be an opportunity to do that again. They may be in similar situations. So I'm thinking, if I'm asking them to do an observation, let's say for introduction to teaching, these are students who are considering teaching. So how could I tailor that part? Because are they even in a position to make really, truly an observation that would be, in a way, it sounds like they would be judging the teacher that they were observing. So kind of.
Yeah, and that's more appropriate at an advanced level, you're right. So for people at the introductory level, maybe something like, what questions does this raise for you as you look ahead into your profession, or as you look ahead into upcoming courses? I think that would be appropriate for entry-level classes in a discipline. Anybody else have other suggestions? I know we've got other faculty from similar disciplines here.
I sometimes encourage students to look at alternative ways of doing things. If they have observed a teacher doing something, is there another possible idea?
Yeah, so even if they liked what the teacher did, maybe what other things could you have done? Which would, especially for beginners, would take them out of the role of passing judgment on a more experienced teacher, but just ask them to think creatively based on what they do know about what's possible. So yeah, that's a good question. This model is, it does come from graduate level healthcare training. So if you're teaching freshmen or sophomores, yeah, their responses are not going to be as fully developed or as sophisticated. I'm sorry, someone had their hand, yeah, Carmen.
I love the idea. I tried to do something last year with my Spanish for Nurses classes in terms of them facing cultural competence and diversity and approaching and understanding the Hispanic culture. And I feel that I needed that too.
Well, now you have it.
No, thank you, Rachel.
No, and I want to state again, that's why I was very clear to give you footnotes here. I did not invent this, I just put it in a diagram, and I prepared to talk to you about it, okay? So, my expertise is limited. Yes,
I think this is huge for the performing arts.
okay, yeah, how does it work there?
There is always a now what.
Yeah, no, that's true,
You
yeah,
always go
absolutely.
into the next performance, and that, I mean, for whether it's an individual setting, private study, or group setting, ensembles, there is always the process to reflect on, of preparation, but then there's the actual performance itself, the what, the so what, especially the course material, that second piece. What did we talk about in this process? What skills, what specific concepts, pedagogy did we work on that maybe we didn't quite get right, or that as an individual didn't quite get right, and then that naturally rolls into now what? We have something to work on in the next part of that process. So this is a very robust thing for us, and quite honestly, I don't know many music schools that really emphasize this a lot, but it seems to be a natural thing to do, and I think it's one of those things as like conductors or directors of especially ensembles, we kind of get into a performance-based, we're always going to the next thing, and it's hard to stop. You have to really force yourself to stop and pedagogically focus on, okay, let's get everyone thinking back, what happened, and let's get retooled for the next time, for the next event. It's just really a great thing for us.
Rachel,
Yeah.
for disciplines that you're really trying to get at students' preconceived notions, or preconceived ideas, a second assignment after reflective writing is very important, because then you can ask questions about the writing to a certain extent, to seek to try and draw out, maybe even provide some dissonance there. When you think this, but why did it not work here in this situation, for instance? So the
Yeah.
questions you ask are extremely important in engendering proper reflection on matters.
Yeah, and first of all, I'm really interested in this application to performance, because we tend to think of music performance as something where writing is not relevant. I've had music majors tell me, I'm a music major, I don't have to write any more papers. So at first glance, you think, oh, these are really, really different fields, but your response and the kind of seamless integration into what you do shows that they're not. And then Mark's comment goes back to what I said at the beginning, that particularly if this is writing that's in the middle of a course, not some kind of summative assessment, but something in the middle of a course, the way that you respond is really important. Because sometimes students will reflect and they'll apply course material, but they'll apply it incorrectly or superficially, or or something that you as the professor can then follow up on and deepen that learning. Now, if it's an end of semester assignment, you don't have as much chance for that. So it depends what you're doing and when it appears in your course. But students will always value writing more if you're responding to it in some way. And so if you really want them to take these reflections seriously, then you've got a responsibility for some kind of serious response. Are there other thoughts or comments? Yes?
since critical thinking skill number 5 was seared into my brain, it's, and it was a good thing.
So last cute.
Yeah.
That was so 10 years ago, Jen.
I know. My brain is still, it's still there, and I use it, and I was thinking on the now what. I asked the students to take the opposing viewpoint. So it's, you know, okay, what is going on here, and so what? How does that, what does that mean to you, and how does it relate to what we've been reading? Now, take the opposing viewpoint. Why do other people not agree with you? Because their ethical decision, you know, that's problem solving. And so one of the steps in that skill number 5 was think outside the box. Put yourself in somebody else's position. Why do they think the way they do? And so it becomes an extension of the analysis, but it's also, it prepares them for future encounters.
Yeah, so you can complicate these sub-boxes a little bit. So you could add another one about looking at counter opinions, or people with other experiences, or people who disagree. That's probably more appropriate at the higher levels, because they have more stuff to work with. But yeah, you can kind of enrich these brief descriptions in any number of ways to enhance critical thinking. And I'll admit, until I really started thinking more carefully about it, I hated the term reflective writing, because it seemed like it was being used as the opposite of critically engaged writing, you know? So there's writing that's all about my feelings, and there's academic writing. And even as a writing specialist, I had that prejudice that I would engage in personal writing sometimes with my students, but it always felt separate from the main work of the class. And then I started to think about it some more as we were building up to the QEP last year, and I started to do some research, and I realized, no, there's a really strong critical thinking engagement in good reflective writing. Again, we can go back to the bad ones where it's not present, but in the best ones, it's not a separate thing. And so I'm glad to find some ways to talk about that. Yes?
This is really technical and not very interesting, but, the prompt that we have right now, the QP for the final event when they're graduating, is a paragraph long, and it's got all that stuff in it, but it's all, we read it this morning in the capstone workshop, it's like, so, I mean, it was written by a committee, and everybody threw their part in, and so it's this big. Is it wise to sort of separate that out?
I think students will do better if you do construct a prompt that separates it out. Because as somebody said early, we don't teach them how to do reflective writing. You know, we teach them how to do a 5-paragraph essay, we teach them argumentation, but because reflective writing is kind of considered a more personal style, we generally don't teach models like this explicitly. And so construct a prompt that helps students figure it out, or take 10 minutes and show a diagram like this, you know, and that'll solve the problem too. But I think you're right that I've seen those questions, and there are these huge questions on these big issues about global citizenship, and they've all got 5 or 6 sub-questions, and students are supposed to handwrite a comprehensive answer in 30 minutes. Like, I couldn't do that.
I didn't read the question in 30 minutes.
No, to really read the question and think about possibilities, yeah, it would take me at least half the time to get my head around it. So if you can structure a question that sort of guides students in how they should shape their response, I think that's really helpful to them. And after a while, if you do reflective writing regularly, they'll get it. So that's why I wanted to show the model in this form visually, so that you can kind of get a sense of how you might structure your prompts. Yes?
Okay, it's our job then to assess their reflective writing.
Yes, it
Would you recommend a 6-point rubric?
Possibly. I'm going to show you some sample rubrics in just a minute. So thank you for thinking that. So anyway, I think you've got the model. Most of you took pictures of it. It'll be in the PowerPoint that Michael puts up at some point. Good. Can we move to assessment? Okay, I got 10 minutes left. Oh, sorry, this text isn't big enough, but I'll tell it to you. I want to start, there's a sample rubric that I'm going to link you to here. It's from the University of Louisville, and this is from their medical school. upgrading my browser. This is, as you can see, a rubric that was designed to assess cultural competence, which Carmen mentioned, I think it was Carmen's, in working with her nursing students. And I just wanted you to see some of the things that they looked for on this rubric and the ways that they broke it down. You can make any kind of rubric you want, okay? You don't have to follow one of these models exactly. It can look more like a checklist than a grid. I don't mean this to be prescriptive, but sometimes it's helpful to just have some models of what people looked for when they were assessing student writing. So this one starts first with organization, and it's just three levels of performance. Professional presentation, depth. I think maybe for us, 3, 4, and 5 are the most interesting, because that's where this rubric gets to some of these things that we've been talking about as key in reflective writing. So in the category of depth, writer shows connection to topic and an engagement with the case. In content, applied all 4 C's of patient communication to the reflection of the case. That's a specific anchor to something that obviously they covered in the class. So the 4 C's aren't listed here, but a student who'd been in the class would know what those are. And if all 4 of them are exhibited, then they get full credit there. And you can see they break down for lesser mastery. And then here, they're concerned about point of view and patients' doctor's ability to see things from other perspectives. So exhibited cultural competence by considering the case from family, patient, or other professionals' point of view. And that goes maybe a little bit to what Jerry was saying too, about integrating other perspectives into your response. And so it's 5 learning traits that are being assessed in this rubric. They're assessed at kind of a 1, 2, 3 level of performance, and then a grade and some notes down at the end. This is specifically from a med program, but I can see this as being very workable in a lot of different disciplines. You change the descriptors a little bit, of course, but the basic concept is pretty simple. You could make it work in your class, and it's getting at the key features of reflective writing. Okay, I've got a couple others I want to show you. Any questions or comments on this one? And there are like 100,000 sample rubrics online. Again, I did not make any of these for this presentation. Some of them are better than others. So the ones I'm showing you today, I think are better. If you're going to create a rubric for your class, look at some that are online, take them as models, but you should always tailor it to your class. So what is the specific content that you have covered that you want to assess? Maybe in your case, you're not as concerned about point of view, but you're concerned about something else. So take some inspiration from the models, but tie your rubric specifically to what you're doing with your students. I think I want to do this one next, which is from University of Minnesota. And this is from the humanities. Well, so it's an education course, but of course that studies culture and diversity. And the text on this is probably small for you to read, but the categories that are rated are self-disclosure, connection to outside experiences, connection to readings, connection to class discussion and course objectives, and then spelling and grammar errors. You decide how important those are to you. Depending on what the finished product is, they may be very important or they may be barely important. Your choice. Based on what a couple people talked about earlier, maybe let's just take a minute and look at this line about self-disclosure. And let me just read it in case the text is too small for you to see. But at the highest level, the student seeks to understand concepts by examining openly your own experiences in the past as they relate to the topic to illustrate points you're making. Demonstrates an open, non-defensive ability to self-appraise, discussing both growth and frustrations as they related to learning in class. Risks asking probing questions about self and seeks to answer these. Even that, I think, is interesting, that it puts in terms of risks asking questions about yourself and seeking to answer, not just spilling your guts on the paper. Although some of that may happen depending what the topic is. But it's trying to direct students away from using reflection as therapy into thoughtful reflection. And so I thought that was a kind of nicely constructed descriptor. And then going down the rubric, there are lower levels of performance in that category. And if you note at the bottom, this rubric is to assess a paper that's 2 pages long. So it's not, does that seem a lot or a little to you, Luana? So, yeah, so what they're wanting to see here is primarily content, but this doesn't mean that you're always reading 15-page papers. Okay, let me show you one more. I have to open a document to get to this one, I think. From Oregon State. And I put this one in because this one was designed by their Center for Teaching Excellence, and it is completely generic. So you'll notice at the top, it just says professor to provide with the course content. And then what the Center for Teaching and Learning at OSU has done is then they wrote this section down here that gets at the key thinking features of reflective writing. So self-awareness, critical thinking and analyzing perspectives, depth of reflection, synthesis and integration. So the idea is that any one of us could use these 4 lines on the rubric, and then we could add whatever we wanted about our specific course content. So out of all of them, this might be the one that's most universally useful to you guys. But I thought there were some interesting elements in all 3, and I see all 3 of them as well thought out, connected to the model that I showed you, and useful in providing meaningful feedback fairly quickly. That's the benefit of a rubric, is that you mark those performance levels, and then you'll still write some comments, but you don't have to write the same thing every time, because you've bundled a lot of it into the rubric. Okay? Here endeth the